March 14, 1720. 73 Africans were dragged off a ship in chains at Turkey Island, Virginia. They had survived 62 days crossing the Atlantic Ocean in darkness and filth. Many hadn't. Their bodies had been thrown overboard somewhere between the West African coast and the James River. Now they stood on a wooden dock, blinking in the Virginia sunlight, waiting to be sold. One man stood closest to them, a wealthy planter in an expensive coat. He wasn't looking at their faces. He was doing math in his head. 800 pounds sterling for 73 people. That came out to about 11 pounds per person, cheaper than horses. And unlike horses, these people would have children. Children he would own. Children who would have more children. Free labor. Forever. This man's investment would pay off beyond anything he imagined. His children would become some of the most powerful people in Virginia. His grandchildren would help create a new nation called America. His great-great-grandchildren would become presidents, Supreme Court justices, and senators. His name would be written in history books as a founding father. But first, he had to brand these 73 people with hot iron. Today, William Randolph's portrait hangs in the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, Virginia. The painting was commissioned sometime in the early 1700s, back when Virginia planters started calling themselves gentlemen instead of farmers. In the portrait, Randolph sits in a carved wooden chair. He wears a silk waistcoat imported from London. His powdered wig is perfectly curled. One hand rests on a leather-bound book, probably Virgil or Cicero, something that screamed education and old-world sophistication. His posture is straight, dignified, the kind of posture that says, I belong to something greater than myself. The painting shows wealth. It shows power. It shows a man who built something permanent in the Virginia wilderness. But look closer at what's not in the painting. No tobacco fields stretching behind him. No slave quarters 400 yards from the main house. No branding irons. No auction blocks in Richmond where his children would later sell human beings to cotton plantations in Georgia and Alabama. And most importantly, no faces, no black faces anywhere in the frame. William Randolph imported 168 enslaved people into Virginia between 1680 and 1710. His descendants would own over 800 more across 4 generations. But you wouldn't know that from looking at this portrait. You'd think he made his fortune from books and good posture. There are 11 Randolph family portraits hanging in museums across Virginia today. Monticello has 3. Colonial Williamsburg has 2. The Virginia Historical Society has 4 more. Not one shows an enslaved person. That absence is a lie. To understand how William Randolph became one of America's first oligarchs, you have to understand what Colonial Virginia was between 1680 and 1750. Virginia wasn't wilderness anymore. By 1700, 60,000 English colonists lived there, most crowded around 3 major rivers, the James, the York, and the Rappahannock. These rivers were highways. Tobacco didn't travel well on dirt roads, but floated perfectly on barges down to the Atlantic Ocean and across to English markets. And tobacco was everything. 1 pound of Virginia tobacco sold for 10 to 12 pence in London. A good plantation could produce 50,000 pounds per year. Do the math. That's 250 pounds sterling annually. In a world where a skilled craftsman in England made maybe 30 pounds a year, Virginia planters were getting obscenely rich. But tobacco farming required massive amounts of labor. One person could manage about 3 acres of tobacco plants. To run a profitable plantation, you needed at least 30 workers, preferably more. At first, Virginia used indentured servants, poor English people who agreed to work for 7 years in exchange for passage to America. But indentured servants eventually went free. They demanded land of their own. They caused problems. Some even started rebellions, like Nathaniel Bacon did in 1676. So after 1680, Virginia's planter class made a choice. They replaced white indentured servants with black enslaved laborers. Permanent ownership. No freedom after 7 years. And better yet, any children born to enslaved women automatically became property too. By 1756, 120,000 enslaved people lived in Virginia. They outnumbered white colonists in some counties along the James River. 3 forces controlled Colonial Virginia: tobacco wealth, slave labor, and dynastic marriage alliances. The richest families didn't just build plantations. They built networks. The Randolphs married into the Carters. The Carters married into the Byrds. The Byrds married into the Lees. The Lees married into the Harrisons. The Harrisons married into the Custis family. By 1750, you couldn't find a powerful family in Virginia that wasn't connected to every other powerful family. They called themselves the First Families of Virginia. From Richmond west of Tuckahoe, along a 100-mile corridor of the James River, these families controlled everything. They sat in the House of Burgesses and wrote Virginia's laws. They served as county judges and decided legal disputes. They controlled the colonial militia and put down slave rebellions. They even controlled the Anglican church parishes and decided who got baptized. If you were born into one of these families in 1720, your life was set. You'd inherit land, enslave people, and a network of cousins who control Virginia's government. You'd marry someone equally wealthy. Your children would do the same. Forever. But if you were born black in Virginia in 1720, your life was also set. You'd be owned. Your children would be owned. Your grandchildren would be owned. Forever. This is where America's old money was born. Not in Boston or Philadelphia. Right here, in Virginia soil, watered with blood. William Randolph was born around 1651 in Moreton Morell, a small village in Warwickshire, England. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where nothing ever changed, and where opportunities were scarce if you weren't the oldest son. William wasn't the oldest son. His father, Richard Randolph, was minor gentry, technically a gentleman, but not wealthy. The family owned some land, but not enough to divide between multiple children. Under English inheritance law, everything went to the eldest brother. William got an education, and not much else. He learned to read Latin. He studied basic law and accounting. He developed the skills of a clerk, a middleman, someone who could manage other people's money. But by the time he turned 20, William understood something crucial about England. He would never be rich there, not as a younger son, not without land or inheritance. So in 1673, at age 22 or 23, William Randolph boarded a ship and sailed for Virginia. He arrived with nothing but education and connections. A distant cousin had already settled in Virginia and worked as a tobacco merchant. That connection got William his first job as a clerk in Henrico County, keeping records for planters who shipped their tobacco to England. This was when William started watching and calculating. He saw how much money flowed through Virginia. He saw planters earning more in one tobacco season than his father made in a decade back in England. He saw land selling for practically nothing compared to English prices. Most importantly, he saw that Virginia's social structure wasn't fixed yet. There was no old aristocracy blocking younger sons from climbing. If you were smart, ambitious, and willing to make certain choices, you could become gentry yourself. William was all three. His first break came in 1680 when he married Mary Isham. The Isham family had arrived in Virginia a generation earlier and already owned significant land along the James River. Mary's uncle, Henry Isham, sat in the House of Burgesses and had connections throughout the colonial government. Suddenly, William Randolph wasn't just a clerk anymore. He was related to power. Within 2 years of marriage, William purchased Turkey Island, 2,400 acres on the northern bank of the James River, 40 miles upstream from the capital at Williamsburg. The land was good tobacco-growing soil, flat and fertile near the river, with easy water access for shipping. But land without labor was worthless. William had a choice. He could purchase indentured servants, white laborers who cost less up front but would go free after 7 years. Or he could purchase enslaved Africans, much more expensive initially but permanent property. William chose permanent property. In 1683, he made his first documented slave purchase. 6 African men and 2 African women from a ship that had docked in Jamestown. The total cost was 68 pounds sterling, nearly 2 years of income for a middle-class English family. But William wasn't thinking about the cost. He was thinking about the return. Those 8 people could cultivate about 24 acres of tobacco. At 50 pounds of tobacco per acre, that meant 1,200 pounds a crop annually. At 10 pence per pound, that was 50 pounds sterling in profit every single year. The investment paid for itself in less than 18 months. After that, it was pure profit. And the children born to those 2 women, they belonged to William too. Free labor for the next generation. This was the business model that built Virginia. And William Randolph was very, very good at business. In 1687, after Bacon's rebellion had destabilized Virginia's western frontier, the colonial government sold confiscated properties at discount prices. William purchased Curl's Neck Plantation, 1,400 acres just downriver from Turkey Island. Then he bought Tuckahoe, another large tract further west. Then Dungeness. By 1700, William Randolph controlled 4 major plantations spanning the James River corridor. He also controlled the people who worked them. Between 1680 and 1710, William Randolph personally imported or purchased 168 enslaved people and indentured servants. Most were African. Some were Caribbean. A few were English criminals who had been transported to the colonies as punishment. It didn't matter to William where they came from. What mattered was that they produced tobacco, and tobacco produced wealth. William and Mary had 9 children who survived to adulthood. Each child inherited land and enslaved people. Each married into another powerful Virginia family. His son William Randolph too married Elizabeth Beverly, connecting the Randolphs to the Beverly fortune. His daughter Mary married James Keith, linking them to Scottish colonial officials. His son Thomas married Judith Fleming, binding them to wealthy Henrico County planters. By the time William Randolph died in 1711, he had built something unprecedented in Virginia, a dynasty. His children controlled thousands of acres across central Virginia. His grandchildren would sit in the House of Burgesses and the Governor's Council. His great-grandchildren would sign the Declaration of Independence. His great-great-grandchildren would become President of the United States. Everything was about to change for Virginia, and for the 800 people who would work Randolph plantations for the next 150 years. 800 people who would never appear in family portraits. 800 people whose names would be recorded in property ledgers, but never in family Bibles. 800 people who built America's first old money, and never saw a penny of it. William Randolph didn't just get lucky. He built his empire methodically, piece by piece, enslaved person by enslaved person. In 1684, Virginia's colonial government appointed him to the House of Burgesses, representing Henrico County. This wasn't just an honor, it was power. The House of Burgesses wrote Virginia's laws, including the laws about slavery. The men who sat in that chamber decided how severely escaped slaves would be punished, whether enslaved people could testify in court, and what happened to the children of enslaved women. William Randolph helped write those laws. Then he profited from them. By 1686, He had been named clerk of the House of Burgesses. By 1694, he was appointed Attorney General of the Virginia colony. These positions paid modestly, but they gave William something far more valuable: access. He knew which lands were being confiscated. He knew which planters were in debt. He knew which ships were arriving from Africa with human cargo. His 4 plantations formed the backbone of his wealth. Turkey Island, where it all began, sat on 2,400 acres of prime James River bottomland. Curl's Neck, just downriver, added another 1,400 acres. Tuckahoe, further west toward the fall line, brought in another 3,500 acres. Dungeness, his smallest holding, contributed another 800 acres. But land was just land. What made it valuable was what worked it. On March 8, 1690, a Royal African Company ship named the Elizabeth and Mary docked at Jamestown, carrying 114 enslaved Africans who had survived the Middle Passage from the Gold Coast. William Randolph purchased 23 of them for £510. This was his largest single purchase. 23 human beings, 12 men, 8 women, 3 children. The math was simple. Brutal but simple. One enslaved person could manage 3 to 4 acres of tobacco. Tobacco plants required constant attention. Transplanting seedlings, removing tobacco hornworms by hand, topping the plants to force energy into the leaves, cutting and curing in specialized barns. It was backbreaking work from March through October. Each acre produced roughly 1,000 to 1,200 pounds of dried tobacco. At 10 to 12 pence per pound in London markets. That meant each enslaved worker generated approximately 50 to 60 pounds sterling in annual profit. William had paid 20 to 30 pounds per person in 1690. That meant his investment paid for itself in 6 to 8 months. After that, every harvest was pure profit. And unlike livestock, enslaved people produced more enslaved people. The Virginia Colonial Assembly had passed a law in 1662 declaring that children inherited their mother's legal status. If the mother was enslaved, her children were automatically enslaved. This meant that the 8 women William purchased in 1690 weren't just workers. They were breeding stock. Any children they bore would belong to William Randolph and their children's children, forever. By 1695, William Randolph ledgers showed 47 enslaved people working across his 4 plantations. Most were concentrated at Turkey Island and Tuckahoe, where the best tobacco land was located. A few worked as house servants. Several were children under age 10, not yet old enough for field work, but already counted as property in his estate documents. On March 15, 1695, William sat at his study at Turkey Island calculating his annual profit. 47 enslaved workers, each generating roughly 50 pounds sterling per year. That was 2,350 pounds of annual income from human labor alone. For comparison, the governor of Virginia earned 300 pounds annually. A successful London merchant might make 200 pounds per year. William Randolph, less than 25 years after arriving in Virginia with nothing, was earning 10 times what his father made back in Warwickshire. This was the foundation of American aristocracy, not built on noble blood or royal favor, built on the calculated exploitation of human beings treated as equipment, built on children born into chains, built on women forced to reproduce, built on men worked from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, 50 weeks a year, until their bodies gave out. William Randolph was one of the first, but he wouldn't be the last. The model he perfected would spread across Virginia like a disease, and it would make his family the most powerful dynasty in American history. William Randolph and Mary Isham had 9 children who survived to adulthood. Each one became a weapon in building the family empire. This wasn't love or family values. This was strategy. His eldest son, William Randolph II, married Elizabeth Beverly in 1705. The Beverly family controlled massive tobacco lands in Essex County along the Rappahannock River. That marriage merged two fortunes and gave the Randolphs political power in Northern Virginia. His daughter Mary married James Keith, the King Surveyor for Virginia. Keith controlled access to land grants and knew exactly which territories were being opened for settlement. Useful information for a family accumulating plantations. His son Thomas married Judith Fleming, daughter of one of Henrico County's largest planters. More land, more enslaved people, more connections to Richmond's emerging merchant class. His daughter Elizabeth married Richard Bland, linking the Randolphs to one of Virginia's most respected legal families. Richard Bland, Jr. would later become one of the most influential voices in Virginia's House of Burgesses. His son Isham married Jane Rogers, connecting them to the Rogers plantation dynasty in Hanover County. His daughter Jane married Bowlecock. His son Thomas married another branch of the Fleming family. Every marriage was calculated. Every union brought land, enslaved people, or political power. By 1750, 40 years after William Randolph's death, his descendants were connected to every major family in Virginia. The Randolphs married into the Carters. Robert King Carter, who died in 1732, controlled 300,000 acres across Virginia's northern neck and owned more than 500 enslaved people. His wealth made him the richest man in British North America. When Carter's grandchildren married Randolph grandchildren, those fortunes merged. The Randolphs married into the Byrds. William Byrd, too, owned Westover Plantation, one of the grandest estates in Virginia, plus 179,000 acres scattered across the colony, and 220 enslaved people. The Byrd Library was the finest in Virginia. The Byrd name carried cultural prestige that even money couldn't buy. The Randolphs married into the Lees. The Lee family would produce Richard Henry Lee and Francis Lightfoot Lee, both signers of the Declaration of Independence, plus Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general. Every Lee in Virginia could trace their ancestry back to a Randolph marriage. The Randolphs married into the Harrisons. The Harrison family of Berkeley Plantation produced Benjamin Harrison V., another signer of the Declaration, plus William Henry Harrison and Benjamin Harrison, both future presidents. The Randolphs married into the Bowlings, the Epps, the Jeffersons, the Marshalls, and the Custis families. This wasn't a family tree. It was a web, a network of intermarried dynasties controlling Virginia's economy, government, and social structure. Along the James River corridor, from Richmond west to Charlottesville, more than 40 major plantations operated within a 50-mile radius. The Randolphs owned or had family connections to 37 of them. When you traveled Virginia's Plantation Road in 1750, you were traveling through Randolph territory. By 1750, the combined first families controlled an estimated 2,000 enslaved people across central Virginia. The Randolph branch alone held at least 300, but Virginia's economy was changing. Tobacco prices had started declining by the 1790s. European markets were saturated. Competition from Kentucky and Tennessee drove prices even lower. The soil in Virginia's Tidewater region was exhausted after a century of tobacco cultivation. Virginia's plantation owners needed a new business model. They found it in human beings. By the 1800s, Virginia had become America's largest exporter of enslaved people. The domestic slave trade turned Virginia into a breeding ground for the Deep South's cotton empire. Planters in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana needed workers. Virginia planters supplied them. Richmond became the second largest slave market in America, behind only New Orleans. The auction houses on Wall Street and Franklin Street in Richmond saw thousands of enslaved people sold every year. Families were separated on those blocks. Mothers torn from children, husbands from wives. Children as young as 8 sold individually to cotton plantations 1,000 miles away. Between 1810 and 1860, more than 300,000 enslaved people were sold from Virginia to the Deep South. 300,000 human beings marched in chains from the James River to the cotton fields of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The price of enslaved people skyrocketed. In 1800, a healthy enslaved man might sell for $300. By 1860, that same man would sell for $1,500, a 500% increase. Enslaved women of childbearing age were even more valuable because their children represented future profit. The Randolph-Carter network profited enormously. They shared ownership of enslaved people through inheritance and marriage. When a Randolph daughter married a Lee son, enslaved people moved between plantations as wedding gifts. When a Carter patriarch died, enslaved people were divided among heirs like furniture. Estate records from the 1820s show enslaved people being sold to settle Randolph family debts, shipped south to Richmond's auction houses, then transported to Mississippi River plantations. And through it all, the family commissioned portraits. When Thomas Mann Randolph commissioned his portrait in 1810, he sat in his finest clothes at Tuckahoe Plantation. The painting showed a distinguished Virginia gentleman, educated, refined, a former governor of Virginia. The portrait hung proudly in the family home. It never mentioned the 127 enslaved people who worked Tuckahoe that year. Never mentioned the 12 who had been sold to Georgia the year before to pay debts. Never mentioned the breeding practices that kept Tuckahoe's enslaved population stable even as people were sold away. The portrait showed a gentleman. The ledgers showed a slave trader. Both were true. That was the system Virginia built. History remembers William Randolph. History forgets Eve. Eve was purchased by William Randolph in 1695 from a ship that arrived at Jamestown from Barbados. She had been born in West Africa, survived the Middle Passage, worked on a Caribbean sugar plantation for 2 years, then was resold to Virginia. She was 19 years old when William bought her for 22 pounds sterling. She was assigned to Turkey Island Plantation as a field worker. For 25 years, Eve worked Virginia tobacco fields. She planted seedlings in April. She removed worms in June. She cut and hauled tobacco in September. She worked pregnant. She worked sick. She worked until her hands bled and her back gave out. Eve bore 7 children between 1697 and 1714. All 7 were born enslaved. All 7 became William Randolph's property the moment they drew breath. 3 worked Turkey Island their entire lives. 2 were sold to neighboring plantations. 1 died at age 4. 1 ran away in 1722 and was never found. Eve died in 1720 at age 44. The plantation ledger noted her death with a single line: Negro woman Eve, deceased, valued at 15 pounds. After 25 years of labor, she was worth less than when William bought her. Used up, worn out, discarded, her children were worth more. Jupiter was born at Tuckahoe Plantation around 1715. His mother's name wasn't recorded. His father's name wasn't recorded. Property doesn't need family histories. Jupiter was a blacksmith, a skilled craftsman who could forge tools, shoe horses, repair wagon wheels, and create the iron hardware that held plantation buildings together. In any free society, Jupiter's skills would have made him prosperous. He could have opened his own shop, hired apprentices, built a reputation. But Jupiter wasn't free. In the 1740s, Jupiter asked permission to hire himself out to neighboring plantations during slack seasons. He wanted to earn money to purchase his freedom. Virginia law technically allowed enslaved people to buy themselves if their owners agreed. The Randolph family refused. Jupiter was too valuable. A good blacksmith was worth twice what a field worker cost. Letting him buy his freedom would mean losing that value. Jupiter worked at Tuckahoe for 50 years. He shod every horse the Randolph family rode. He forged every tool their field workers used. He made the iron gates that still hang at Tuckahoe today. Tourists photograph those gates. No one tells them Jupiter made them. No one knows if Jupiter ever saw a penny beyond the basic food and clothing all enslaved people received. He died at Tuckahoe around 1780, age 65. He was buried in the unmarked slave cemetery behind the plantation. His gravestone was wood. It rotted away decades ago. Sally worked as a house servant at Curl's Neck Plantation. She was trusted enough to care for white children, serve meals in the main house, and handle the family's finest china. That trust meant nothing in 1823 when the Randolph family needed cash. Virginia's economy was in recession. Tobacco prices had collapsed. The family decided to sell off some surplus, enslaved people to cotton plantations in Georgia. Sally had 3 children: David, age 11, Rebecca, age 8, Mary, age 4. When the slave trader arrived at Curl's Neck to inspect the people being sold, he wanted Sally. House servants brought premium prices in deep South markets because they were refined and civilized. He didn't want her children. Children under 12 were considered poor investments for cotton work. Sally was marched to Richmond, chained in a coffle with 17 other enslaved people from various Virginia plantations, and walked 600 miles to a Georgia auction house. She was sold to a cotton plantation outside Macon for $870. Her children remained at Curl's Neck. David was sold to a different plantation in 1826. Rebecca died of fever in 1827. Mary's fate was never recorded in family papers. Sally never saw any of them again. She lived until 1851. She died picking cotton in Georgia, 900 miles from her children. Peter tried to run. In 1807, Peter escaped from Dungeness Plantation. He made it 40 miles before slave catchers found him hiding in a barn outside Petersburg. He was returned to Dungeness, publicly whipped as an example, and sold within the week to a Mississippi cotton plantation as punishment. The bill of sale described him as healthy Negro male, age approximately 24, prone to running. He sold for $350. The Randolph family took that money and purchased 2 younger enslaved people to replace him. Peter disappeared into Mississippi. No further records exist. Hercules was a master carpenter. He built the main house at Dungeness Plantation in the 1730s. The framing, the floors, the elegant staircase that curved up to the 2nd floor. He built the barns, the outbuildings, the slave quarters where he himself slept. Plantation tourists today marvel at Dungeness craftsmanship, the hand-carved banisters, the perfectly joined beams, the architectural details that show real artistry. Hercules created all of it. He was never credited, never paid, never free. These are 5 people, 5 names, 5 stories among 800. 800 people worked for Randolph plantations across 150 years. Most of their names were never recorded. Their births went unnoted except as property increases in ledgers. Their deaths were marked with valuations, not eulogies. Many were sold south, marched and chained from Virginia's Green James River Valley to Alabama's cotton fields, to Mississippi's Delta plantations, to Louisiana's sugar mills, 1,200 miles on foot. 15 to 20% died during the journey or within their first year in the Deep South. Heat, disease, overwork, broken hearts. These are the 800 people missing from 11 Randolph family portraits hanging in Virginia museums today. Between 1790 and 1850, the Randolph dynasty reached its absolute peak. The family that William Randolph built with chains and tobacco had become American royalty. Randolph descendants didn't just run Virginia. They helped run the entire nation. Thomas Jefferson married Martha Wales Skelton in 1772. Martha was a Randolph descendant through her mother's line. When Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal" in 1776, he owned 130 enslaved people at Monticello. Many had Randolph family connections. The irony was apparently lost on him. John Marshall, who became Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court and served from 1801 to 1835, was a Randolph through his mother Mary Randolph Keith. Marshall's Supreme Court decisions shaped American law for generations. He owned enslaved people his entire life, some inherited through his Randolph family connections. Thomas Mann Randolph Jr. married Thomas Jefferson's daughter Martha in 1790, merging the Randolph dynasty with Jefferson's legacy. Thomas Mann Randolph Jr. served as governor of Virginia from 1819 to 1822. He owned Tuckahoe Plantation and its 127 enslaved people. Randolph descendants served in the United States Congress throughout the 1800s. John Randolph of Roanoke served in the House of Representatives from 1799 to 1829, one of the longest tenures in early American history. Edmund Randolph was the first Attorney General of the United States under George Washington and later became Secretary of State. Peyton Randolph was president of the First Continental Congress in 1774. When the Civil War began, multiple Randolph descendants served as Confederate generals and officers. The family that helped found America fought to preserve slavery when America finally tried to end it. The physical monuments to Randolph power still stand today. Tuckahoe Plantation, built in the 1730s and expanded in the 1750s, sprawls across 8,000 square feet. The H-shaped Georgian mansion features elaborate woodwork, a grand staircase, and carefully manicured grounds. It's been featured in history documentaries and period films. Tourists can tour it today for $15. The main house has been beautifully preserved. Every room restored to colonial perfection. But walk 400 yards behind the house, past the manicured gardens, and you'll find ruins of the slave quarters. Crumbling brick foundations, depressions in the ground where wooden cabins once stood. This is where 127 people lived in 1820, in structures that Virginia's Historic Preservation Society hasn't bothered to restore. Turkey Island, where William Randolph started his empire, is now mostly ruins. The main house burned in the 1800s, but you can still see the foundations if you drive Route 5 along the James River. A historical marker notes that this was home to William Randolph, founder of the Randolph family dynasty. The marker mentions his political positions and his descendants. It doesn't mention the 168 enslaved people he imported. Between 1790 and 1850, the Randolph family commissioned at least 11 major portraits. Professional artists from Richmond, Philadelphia, and even London painted Randolph men, women, and children. These weren't cheap. Portrait commissions cost between $50 and £200, the equivalent of $10,000 to $40,000 today. Every portrait shows the same things: fine clothes, educated bearing, refined surroundings, books, elegant furniture. Some include plantation landscapes in the background, carefully painted to show rolling green hills and stately mansions. Not one portrait shows an enslaved person, not in the background, not as a servant, not anywhere in the frame. This was deliberate. By the early 1800s, Northern abolitionists were starting to criticize Southern slavery. Virginia's planter class responded by sanitizing their public image. They called themselves gentlemen farmers. They emphasized their classical education and cultured tastes. They commissioned portraits that showed them as enlightened landowners, not slave traders. In 1820s Virginia, the Randolphs were aristocracy. They attended St. John's Church in Richmond, the same church where Patrick Henry gave his "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death" speech in 1775. The Randolphs sat in the front pews. They hosted elaborate parties at their plantations. They sent their sons to the College of William and Mary and Harvard. They sent their daughters to finishing schools in Philadelphia. Richmond society treated them like nobility. Newspapers announced Randolph weddings, births, and social events. When a Randolph died, the obituary filled half a page and listed every distinguished ancestor back to William himself. The invisible workforce made all of it possible. In 1820, Tuckahoe Plantation alone held 127 enslaved people. Turkey Island had 83. Dungeness had 41. Curl's Neck had 62. Those are just the 4 original William Randolph plantations. His descendants owned dozens more properties across Virginia, each with its own enslaved workforce. By 1850, Randolph descendants controlled over 50,000 acres across Virginia and more than 1,000 enslaved people. If you calculated the net worth of all Randolph-connected families, they were easily among the 10 wealthiest extended families in America, all of it built on chains. If you walked past Tuckahoe Plantation in 1830, here's what you saw: white column mansion gleaming in the Virginia sunshine, manicured boxwood gardens laid out in geometric perfection, a crushed shell driveway lined with oak trees, well-dressed white people stepping out of carriages, string quartets playing at garden parties, everything refined, elegant, civilized. Here's what you didn't see if you were just passing by: the slave quarters 400 yards behind the main house, hidden by trees. 127 people living in 23 wooden cabins. Families of 5 or 6 crowded into single-room structures. Dirt floors. No windows. No heat except what a single fireplace could provide in Virginia winters. You didn't see the auction blocks in Richmond where Randolph family agents sold enslaved people to pay debts or make profits. You didn't see the breeding practices that kept the enslaved population stable even as people were sold away. You didn't see the whipping posts. You didn't see the chains. You didn't see Sally being marched to Georgia away from her children. You didn't see Peter whipped and sold to Mississippi. You didn't see Jupiter forging gates he'd never own. You didn't see Hercules building a mansion he'd never be allowed to freely enter through the front door. All of that was carefully hidden, pushed to the margins, erased from the portrait. The Randolphs had built an empire of wealth, power, and prestige that would last for generations, an empire that would produce presidents and Supreme Court justices and senators and governors. But nothing lasts forever, even empires built on chains. Did the Randolph family ever face justice for enslaving 800 people across 150 years? No. When the Civil War began in 1861, Randolph descendants fought on both sides. Some joined Confederate regiments, defending Virginia and the slavery system that had built their wealth. Others fought for the Union, mainly those who had moved to northern states through marriage. But whether they wore gray or blue, none of them suffered consequences for the family's centuries of human trafficking. After 1865, when slavery finally ended, for a million formerly enslaved people across the South waited for reparations that never came. They waited for the 40 acres and a mule that General Sherman had promised. They waited for compensation for stolen labor, stolen lives, stolen childhoods. The Randolph family paid nothing. No land was redistributed. No wealth was returned. No apologies were issued. The formerly enslaved people who had worked Randolph plantations walked away with exactly what they'd arrived with: nothing. Many stayed on as sharecroppers, working the same fields they'd worked as slaves, now paying rent to the same families who had once owned them. The Randolph wealth survived Reconstruction almost completely intact. Tuckahoe Plantation remained in Randolph family hands until 1935, 70 years after emancipation. The family finally sold it during the Great Depression, not because of moral reckoning, but because of financial pressure. Turkey Island, though the main house had burned, remained Randolph property. The land itself was never confiscated, never redistributed. The ruins are still visible today from Route 5. Even more remarkably, the Randolph family reputation remained spotless. By the 1870s, white Southerners had begun constructing what they called the lost cause mythology. This was a revisionist history that romanticized plantation life, downplayed slavery's brutality, and portrayed slaveholders as benevolent paternalists who would care for enslaved people like family. The lost cause turned slave owners into victims of Northern aggression and made the Confederacies fight about states' rights rather than slavery. The Randolph family embraced this mythology eagerly. Early historical accounts written in the late 1800s portrayed the Randolphs as noble founders who had built Virginia's civilization from wilderness. The Virginia Historical Society, founded in 1831 by descendants of first families, published genealogies and histories that emphasized Randolph contributions to American independence, law, and culture. Slavery was mentioned only in passing, if at all. When it was mentioned, it was described as an unfortunate but economically necessary system that the Randolphs had participated in reluctantly. The word enslaver never appeared. Instead, they were called planters, landowners, statesmen, founding fathers. The lie became official history. In 1912, prominent Virginians founded the Order of First Families of Virginia. This genealogical society required proof of descent from Virginia's settlers who had arrived between 1607 and 1624. Membership became a badge of honor, a mark of distinguished ancestry that wealthy Virginians displayed proudly. The Order's founding documents and publications celebrated First Family's role in building Virginia and America. They listed Randolph achievements: attorneys general, governors, congressmen, Supreme Court justices. They detailed the plantations, the architecture, the cultural refinement. They never mentioned the enslaved people who had actually built those plantations. Never mentioned the 800 people who had worked Randolph land. Never mentioned Eve, Jupiter, Sally, Peter, or Hercules. Never mentioned the breeding farms, the auction blocks, or the 300,000 enslaved Virginians sold south to cotton plantations. That history was simply erased. Modern Randolph descendants remain prominent in Virginia today. They work in law firms in Richmond. They sit on corporate boards. They serve in Virginia's state government. Some are doctors, professors, business owners. Many still live in Virginia, still benefit from inherited wealth that traces directly back to William Randolph's 1690 purchase of 23 human beings. None have paid reparations. None have been prosecuted. None have faced any legal consequences whatsoever for their ancestors' crimes. The Randolph family got away with it, completely and totally. They built an empire on chains. They profited for generations, and when slavery finally ended, they kept the wealth and simply changed the story. That's the reckoning that never came. If you want to see how Virginia remembers the Randolph family today, start at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond. William Randolph's portrait hangs in the American Art Wing on the second floor. The museum label reads, William Randolph, circa 1700. Oil on canvas. Attributed to unknown colonial artist. William Randolph, 1651 to 1711, served as Attorney General of Virginia Colony and founded one of Virginia's most distinguished families. The word planter appears. The word landowner appears. The word enslaver does not appear. Walk 15 minutes north to the Virginia Historical Society, and you'll find 3 more Randolph family portraits. Thomas Mann Randolph, Jane Randolph Jefferson, Edmund Randolph, The labels mention their political achievements, their famous marriages, their contributions to Virginia society. None mention how many people they owned. Drive west on Route 5 for 40 minutes, and you'll reach Tuckahoe Plantation. It's open for tours Thursday through Sunday. Admission is $15 for adults. The website calls it one of the most complete examples of colonial plantation architecture in America. The main house has been meticulously restored. The woodwork gleams. The furniture is all period accurate. The gardens are maintained by professional landscapers. Tuckahoe hosts weddings now. A plantation wedding package costs $8,000 and includes use of the grounds, the mansion, and colonial ambience. What you see on a Tuckahoe tour depends entirely on which guide you get. Some guides mention slavery. They'll point out the dependencies, the separate buildings where enslaved people worked as cooks, laundresses, and house servants. They might mention that the plantation relied on enslaved labor. They'll use that phrase, relied on, passive voice, as if enslaved people were a natural resource that the plantation simply utilized. Other guides focus almost entirely on architecture. They'll spend 20 minutes explaining the H-shaped floor plan, the Flemish bond brickwork, the hand-carved chair rails. They'll tell you which room Thomas Jefferson stayed in as a boy. They'll show you the elegant staircase that Hercules built. They won't mention Hercules' name. The slave quarters behind the main house are not part of the standard tour. Tuckahoe also rents itself out as a film location. It's appeared in multiple historical dramas and documentaries. When you see Colonial Virginia on screen, there's a good chance you're looking at Tuckahoe. The plantation earns thousands of dollars annually from these filming fees. Wilton, another Randolph property, was actually moved from its original James River location and reconstructed in Richmond as a house museum. Tours focus on colonial decorative arts and Revolutionary War history. The museum's education programs bring school children through to learn about colonial life. Most leave thinking colonial Virginians just worked really hard at growing tobacco. Curl's Neck Plantation is now ruins on private property. No tours, no historical markers, just crumbling brick foundations slowly being reclaimed by Virginia forest. The enslaved people who worked that land for 150 years have no memorial, no marker, no acknowledgement. If you drive Route 5 along the James River today, Virginia's official plantation road, Scenic Byway, you'll pass 8 former Randolph properties in 40 miles. Scenic markers throughout every few miles. They say things like historic James River plantations, colonial Virginia heritage, and first families of Virginia. What the signs don't say, site where 83 enslaved people worked 1690 to 1865. They don't say 200 people sold from this location to Deep South plantations. They don't say mass grave of enslaved workers, location unknown. Buildings across Virginia bear Randolph names. Randolph-Macon College in Ashland, founded 1830. Randolph Street in Richmond. Randolph Hall in Williamsburg. These names are everywhere, celebrated and honored. What's visible when you tour Virginia today is beauty. Stately homes, rolling green hills, carefully preserved architecture, historic heritage. What's invisible are the 800 people who built it all. The mass graves of enslaved workers, buried in unmarked plots across Virginia. The auction block locations in Richmond, now paved over with parking lots. The slave quarters, demolished or left to rot. The breeding farms, never mentioned in polite company. The whipping posts, burned for firewood. The chains, melted down decades ago. All of it erased. All of it hidden. All of it sanitized into colonial heritage and architectural significance. Virginia turned slavery into tourism, and business is good. Return one final time to William Randolph's portrait hanging in the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond. This is a lie Virginia told itself for 250 years. For generations, the story went like this. William Randolph was a founding father, a gentleman, a builder of Virginia civilization. His descendants helped create America, signed the Declaration of Independence, served as Supreme Court justices and presidents. The Randolph family represented the best of American values: hard work, education, public service, and refined culture. That story was taught in Virginia schools, written in Virginia textbooks, displayed in Virginia museums, celebrated by Virginia historical societies. It became official history, repeated so often that it became truth. But it was a lie. The truth was hidden systematically. Slavery was omitted from textbooks or mentioned only briefly as an economic system. Museum labels focus on architecture and political achievements, not on the humans who were bought and sold. Historic markers along Virginia's roads mention plantations without explaining what that word meant. The word enslaver didn't appear in official Virginia historical documents until the 1990s. But starting in the 2010s, historians began uncovering what Virginia had buried. They found plantation ledgers that documented names of more than 400 enslaved people who worked Randolph properties between 1680 and 1865. They found estate records showing deliberate breeding practices, enslaved women forced to reproduce to maintain plantation labor forces. They found sale receipts documenting families separated, children sold away from mothers, husbands sold away from wives. They found bills of lading from Richmond auction houses, showing Randolph agents selling people to Mississippi and Alabama plantations. They found the truth that Virginia had spent 2 centuries hiding. Enslaved people built every mansion tourists admire today. Enslaved people grew every pound of tobacco that created Randolph wealth. Enslaved people raised white Randolph children, while their own children were sold. Enslaved people cooked every meal visible in those elegant family portraits. Enslaved people carved the banisters, laid the bricks, planted the gardens, and maintained the colonial lifestyle that Virginia markets as heritage tourism. 800 people across 150 years. 800 lives. 800 stories. Erased from 11 family portraits. Erased from historical markers. Erased from museum labels. Erased from Virginia's official memory. The portrait in the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts shows refinement. It shows education. It shows a founding father who helped build America. But the real story of William Randolph is 168 imported lives. It's 800 people enslaved across generations. It's children born in chains. It's families separated for profit. It's American old money built on human suffering. That's what the portrait hides. That's what Virginia buried. That's the lie that's still being told in museums, plantation tours, and historical societies across the state today. This matters now because Virginia still celebrates first families without telling the full story. Most Americans don't know that Virginia ran the largest slave breeding industry in American history. They don't know that 2 million enslaved people were sold from Virginia to Deep South plantations between 1790 and 1865. They don't know the scale of the interstate slave trade that turned Richmond into America's second largest human market. This connects directly to today's wealth gap. The Randolph family and other first families built generational wealth that still exists. That wealth was never redistributed. It was never taxed as the proceeds of crime. It simply passed from generation to generation, compounding over centuries while the descendants of enslaved people started with nothing in 1865 and have spent 160 years trying to catch up. This is about whose history gets remembered and whose gets erased, about whether we honor slaveholders with museum portraits in college buildings, or whether we finally tell the truth about how they made their fortunes. 800 lives erased from 11 portraits. 2 million enslaved Virginians sold south. Generational trauma that continues today. This is a legacy of lies, built on the James River in Colonial Virginia, hidden in family portraits, and still celebrated in museums today. Should Virginia's museums tell the full story? Should plantation tours mention the 800 people who actually built them? Should the order of first families acknowledge the enslaved people who made those families wealthy? What do you think? Let me know in the comments.